Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is JD Bell. I'm a senior security architect with Appsian, and I appreciate you guys joining the webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about, I know the title says we're focusing on GDPR, but I kind of want to raise the level of the conversation to more of a compliance-driven discussion because while GDPR is a very pertinent issue for you guys, there's some other regulations and some evolution we've gone through with some of the other regulations here in the States as well as in Europe that I think have a just as a pertinent impact as well. Again, my name is JD Bell. Been with Appsian about 6 months now. Looking forward to talking to you guys. Want to talk about a couple of housekeeping issues before we get started. Y'all are currently, as you know, all in muted mode. However, if you look at the GoToWebinar interface, you'll see a section for questions, kind of a chat box. Feel free to put any questions in, and we will try to address those at the end. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Whoops, auspicious start. Who is Appsian? I think some of y'all have probably seen our webinars previously, but I want to go ahead and do a quick intro to our company, Appsian, formerly Gray Heller. Essentially, we are an application security company, and we're currently primarily focused in the PeopleSoft arena. And we make, as it says here, we make PeopleSoft exceptional, and we do this in two areas. One, on the user experience side, where we supplement Fluid and make the PeopleSoft experience on mobile devices and stuff, make it a little more pretty, I guess, a little more mobile friendly. But we're not really here to talk about that today. The other side of where we make PeopleSoft exceptional is in the security arena, where we provide granular contextual security to the PeopleSoft application, which in its default mode is kind of a black box. So we try to address that black box to allow access, logging and such to meet things like GDPR. We have 200 plus customers globally. We're a member of the Oracle and PeopleSoft customer advisory boards as well. And as I said, we have a global customer base across multiple verticals. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see we're fairly well represented both in the commercial space, the higher ed space, and the public sector as well. So I want to start off talking about compliance and kind of the evolution of a regulatory environment. And a couple of the regulations I'm going to talk about kind of got started here in the States, but they're just as pertinent, just like GDPR is pertinent to companies in the United States. Some of these regulations I'm about to touch on are also pertinent to people in Europe, because we're kind of in a global environment these days, and you have people kind of going back and forth between Europe, the United States, and everything. So those regulations start having a much more global impact. The compliance environment in the digital information age really got started with the PCI, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. It started in 2004 and is probably the most evolved security standard or compliance standard out there in the information security arena. They've had years to evolve this thing, and it's very comprehensive, and it's kind of the template for a lot that future regulations are trying to follow because it is so comprehensive. It covers everything from maintaining a secure network to implementing strong access controls, vulnerability management programs, and maintaining a slew of policies around protecting credit card data. We then evolved into HIPAA here in the States, which is the protection of healthcare or private health information. It was signed in 1996 and phased in over 2003 to 2005. And again, it's constantly evolving as well, currently made up of 4 rules: the privacy rule, the security rule, the enforcement rule, and the breach notification rule. It applies to all entities that store, process, or transmit private health information. And there's a big focus on EDI messaging. That's where a lot of these rules come into play as far as the exchanging of information between healthcare providers, insurers, and so on. Now we get to GDPR, which I know most of y'all are real familiar with. You guys in the UK live it day to day. So I'm not going to try to tell you things you probably don't already know, but I do want to cover it at a high level. Implemented in May 2018, and it really changed the game in the compliance world simply because now it's not just about breaches anymore. It's also about being able to grant access to data. If somebody's looked at my data, I should be able to request to see who has looked at it, who has accessed, who it's been shared with, and so on. So again, it's not just about covering breaches. It's also about being able to support auditors and such coming in saying, we need to see who has seen sensitive information, essentially. And again, GDPR, the nature of the information that is covered is constantly evolving as well. It's still in its early days. But in general, it's personal data is any information relating to an individual, relates to whether it's private or professional or public life. It's pretty comprehensive. And the real key is going to be who's going to be the first one to get tested. Who's the first, where's the first breach going to occur, and how's that going to be handled? As I'm sure you know, the fines associated with GDPR penalties are pretty exorbitant. Instead of fixed fines like the previous regulations we were talking about, it becomes a percentage of global annual revenue. And you'll see here a couple of examples that in the FTSE 100, if 34 of the companies in the FTSE 100 got hit with a 4% fine, it would wipe out all their profits. A 2% fine would wipe out the profits of 19 of those 100, and a 1% fine would wipe out the profits of 15 of those 100. And just from a kind of looking back perspective, breaches at 29 of the 100 in the last 8 years, the actual breaches that have occurred, would probably have incurred penalties under GDPR. So again, we're just waiting for the first. It's kind of in the early days of the regulation, but somebody's going to get hit first, and it's going to be kind of a test case for the rest of the European Union as well as the United States. Here in the States, we are moving into kind of GDPR-focused types of regulations. We have a new regulation called the California Consumer Privacy Act. It was announced just a couple of months ago and goes into effect in 2020. And I like to call it GDPR Light because it's very similar to GDPR. It hasn't evolved quite as much. That's why we have a couple of years before it goes into play. But again, it focuses on the consumer's right to know how their data is being used. They have the right to know what information is being collected. They have the right to know why it's being collected and who it's being shared with. And it also puts in place additional, more stringent controls around data associated with people, consumers, kids under the age of 16. So that's an interesting wrinkle that's coming into play too, because of all the kids, using their mobile devices and everything. And obviously, companies live and die by collecting information about their users and including those kids that are playing games. And compliance, it never ends. I mean, there's no finish line in compliance. It's kind of a rinse and repeat thing where you start with baseline requirements. You're going through your assessments, you're doing prevention, you're doing detection, and then you just start the cycle all over again. So it's a constantly moving target that needs to be monitored, and processes and such need to be put in place to support it. Now, one of the big keys in managing compliance requirements is kind of establishing an effective risk management posture in the security arena. So we're going to talk a little bit about risk management right now. And what I like to consider is establishing a foundation for risk management. And there's some basic, again, foundational things that companies should be looking to do to establish that posture. And I want to go through these pretty quickly. But before I do, you guys may not be familiar with a famous old baseball player by the name of Yogi Berra. But he's famous for his quotes. He wasn't the brightest bulb in the room, but he came up with some hilarious quotes at times. And one of my favorites of his is, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. Very simplistic and kind of silly, but very applicable when you're talking about, planning in anything really. So when you're preparing for an effective approach to risk management, the foundational items in my mind are: one, you've got to understand the business and regulatory drivers. Obviously, that's going to drive a lot of the decisions that are made, the money that is spent. Is what compliance regulations are you subject to, whether they be, kind of at a national level or an internal corporate level. Excuse me. Number two, ensuring the support and participation of the appropriate stakeholders. No man and no department is an island in any given organization. And to get an effective security posture, you've got to have the participation and the accountability of the various stakeholders that are involved. Three, maintain an identity-based authentication and authorization controls. I mean, identity is the new perimeter. These days, with the mobile arena expanding the way it is, there's no real concept of like physical firewalls protecting an organization, because data is going out to these mobile devices, And the only thing that's really protecting it is authentication and authorization at the mobile level. Number 4, discover and catalog your sensitive data. This is going to be really key because this is what auditors are going to be looking for as far as what are you doing to protect your sensitive data, whether it's that private health information, credit card data, or anything else that kind of evolves under the guise of the regulations and constitutes private or sensitive data. So discovering and cataloging, that is key. Now, this is a no-brainer, and pretty much everybody's doing it these days, but encrypting sensitive data at rest and data in motion, that's kind of a no-brainer. Browsers accomplish a lot of that, especially in the mobile arena. Implement granular application and database access controls and monitoring. And this is kind of the space where Appsian plays, which I'll get into. But ERP applications like PeopleSoft, as I mentioned before, are like black boxes. And you really don't get that granular access control to be able to figure out who's doing what. So it's very challenging to bring those applications into a security posture where you can effectively support audits as well as report on breaches when they occur. Protect sensitive data in all environments. Now, one thing we have noted is that a large percentage of PeopleSoft users deploy PeopleSoft production information in all environments for testing, development, and everything else, just because it's very difficult to redact that information for those lower environments. That's one of the things I'll touch on that Appsian addresses as well. But you've got to protect sensitive data in all environments, not just production, but also in those lower environments. Excuse me. Number 8, implementing a security info and event management system. SIMs, they're kind of becoming commodities these days. You've got platforms like Splunk, Logarithm, QRadar, but they kind of aggregate and correlate amongst events across the enterprise to give you that kind of a 360-degree view of your security posture and what's going on. And then implementing intrusion detection controls and response capabilities. Because again, it's not really about when if it's going to happen, but a breach will happen for most companies, and they've got to be prepared to be able to pick up on when it happened and what the response processes are going to be. Now, we've talked about some of the foundational elements. I want to talk about some of the challenges in today's world around application security. So you've got technology struggles and process challenges. I mean, it's like I said, it's not just about breaches anymore. It's also about who's seen my data. You've got to be able to support audits. You've got to be able to support consumer requests for people that want to know who has accessed their data, who it's been shared with. So there's a whole new range of, I guess, accountability that companies have around the data that they're storing. I mentioned this already. Identity is the new perimeter. You can't just put up a firewall anymore and expect it, that to meet, data protection standards anymore. Again, alluded to this as well. ERP applications are legacy black boxes, and you have a real lack of access, visibility, and auditing. Password management is a constant challenge. That's why Appsian supports, for example, single sign-ons. PeopleSoft out of the box doesn't natively support single sign-on. However, we can work with a typical single sign-on provider such as Okta and so on to bring PeopleSoft into that single sign-on architecture. MFA, multi-factor authentication. A lot of companies are starting to use it. Again, MFA, for those that may not be as familiar with it, is a kind of a step-up validation of identity. And it's typically 2 of the 3 things I list here. Something like a password, something you have, like an app on your phone, or something you are, which gets into the biometric space. But implementing MFA effectively is really key, and I'll show you how Appsian does that at a granular level within PeopleSoft. Patching and maintenance. That's typically the biggest reason for breaches these days is unpatched systems. So it's getting that patching and maintenance on a regular schedule, maintaining, the knowledge needed to put those patches in place, and keeping up with the application developers to make sure that you're putting the right patches in place. Let's talk about the latest breach statistics, and this is coming from the Verizon 2018 breach report. And you can see them. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but I mean, it's very interesting to me that 76% of the recent breaches in 2018, 2017 were financially motivated. So a lot of the bad actors out there are operating in nation states and going for financial gains. 68% of breaches took months or longer to discover. And I can guarantee you that that percentage is skewed towards a lot of the ERP type systems where it can be very difficult to detect a breach, and it can take even longer to kind of remediate it. Phishing's a big part of it right now. I mean, 4% of people will click on any given phishing campaign, and you have 16 minutes until the first click on a phishing campaign before the first report from a savvy user will arrive. So phishing is a big key. We're seeing companies these days implement control phishing programs for education purposes. So it's really key to kind of examine the training and education, which is probably the biggest, I guess the biggest way to deal with phishing type of attacks is education. Private data, how's it getting exposed? We talk about data leakage. How is private data getting outside of PeopleSoft, for example, and getting into the outside world? We talk about things like breaches of executive compensation data. We've seen multiple breaches where people have extracted out compensation data for the executives of any given company and posted that information on social medias, and kind of just seeking some kind of embarrassment factor. So how's the data getting out? Privilege abuse is probably the largest way it is, and that can take a lot of forms in terms of people not having the wrong access rights, not adhering to the principle of least privilege, and so on. But that's probably by far the biggest way we see private data being extracted is by people getting into the system, getting access to things they shouldn't have access to do their jobs. Now let's talk about, are you exposed? And I'm trying to approach this from the standpoint of what auditors will look for, because as we deal with regulations like GDPR and so on, we are going to be in a space where auditors are going to be coming in to check compliance and check what your security posture is. And I like to think of it in three forms: proactive, active, and reactive. So proactive, what kind of proactive controls are you putting in place? Are you enforcing principle of least privilege in your access controls? How are you enforcing authentication versus authorization? And as most of you guys probably know, they're not the same thing. So it's two different things you have to deal with. Data leakage. How are you keeping your information in PeopleSoft, for example? How are you preventing it from getting out? Then we look at the active controls, access logging at a granular level. If somebody came to you and said, hey, I want to see who has looked at this user's sensitive information, whether it's social security numbers, national IDs, are you able to have the logging in place to support those kind of inquiries? Are you doing correlation? That gets back to the SIM platforms. Are you able to establish that 360-degree view of what's going on in the organization in terms of events that may be hitting the network, your applications, and so on? And what are you doing around alerting, which supports remediation? So if there is a breach, is your SIM supporting alerting? Are you able to react in a timely manner to any kind of suspicious activity? And then we talk about the reactive controls, because again, it's not if, but when you get breached. Incident response, how long did it take to detect? How long did it take to respond? Those are the kind of processes that auditors are going to want to see. What's your process for like dealing with breaches in terms of detection and response? So let's talk about Appsian and the space we play in. We like to talk about providing that 360-degree security posture, and we do it in three pillars. The first one being intrusion detection, or excuse me, intrusion prevention. And intrusion prevention, as it says, is about keeping the bad actors out. But it's not just about keeping the bad actors out. It's also about limiting access to sensitive data for all users. What does a person need to see to be able to do their job? Chances are a PeopleSoft administrator, when they're doing, user management, user editing of user records, chances are they don't need to see a social security number, for example, to do their job. So why not mask that data? Because you want to limit that kind of data access even for legitimate users. So Appsian does that in multiple ways, which we'll get into. We have our granular capabilities around MFA, data masking, and data redaction, which I'll show you. The second pillar, data loss prevention, is again, how are we keeping information from getting out of PeopleSoft and getting loose in the wild? It's protecting sensitive data from leaving the organization. And again, it goes back to breaches similar to the executive compensation breach I mentioned before. the bulk download of social security numbers, and so on. Again, we use data level masking, redaction, and MFA integrated at the field level to combat some of this. So again, we provide that data loss prevention. The third pillar, incident response. It's again all about how fast and what processes do you have in place to react and how fast are you able to remediate. Logging becomes a real key into that, and being able to understand those logs. So one of the things I'm going to show you is we've implemented what we call our analytics platform that gives a kind of a dashboard view of user access within PeopleSoft, and it kind of gives you an example of the kind of reporting we could do and how easy it is to spot anomalous behavior when it happens. The application security platform flow, and this gets into how the platform is implemented. The Appsian application security platform is implemented and lives at the PeopleSoft web server level. It's a plug-in to the web server and allows us to intercept traffic and act as a sort of a rules-based firewall at the front door for all requests coming in and out. So you'll see here that we've got some examples, and I'm going to get into another slide that does a better job, I think, of showing some of the use cases. But again, PeopleSoft, we live at the PeopleSoft web server level. There are pages that are installed at the in the database. Those are the pages used to configure the application security platform. Those live within PeopleSoft as well. And then depending on functionality, there may be a small install at the app server level. The key is there's no third-party software, there's no third-party hardware that's required, and it just runs within the PeopleSoft arena. So let's talk a little bit more about the capabilities around the access management that the ASP provides. And again, ASP, Application Security Platform. And you'll see here it's kind of it looks like a firewall because that's basically what it is, but you get a sense here of what we are able to support. So the rules are based on conditions and actions. The conditions, if they're met, the actions are taken. And this kind of gives you an idea of the capabilities we're able to deal with. We're very contextual with PeopleSoft, so our rules engine understands menus, components, pages, roles, users, and can operate on any of those to set up certain use case rules to block or allow behavior, or to force, for example, multi-factor authentication for a behavior that is determined to be riskier. But you can see that we have the ability to operate on a lot of things in the conditions side of this fence. We can fields, records, iScript, IP address ranges can be used for geolocation controls, filtering, and so on. And then if you look at the actions, these are the things the rules are capable of doing. Redirection to an MFA, for example, blocking the transaction entirely, allowing logging. It just gives you an idea of some of the capabilities of the rules at a high level. All right, what I'm going to do now is bring up our demo system, so bear with me for just a moment. Before that, do that. Bring up the browser. All right, what I've got here is a demo system. It's an HCM system, PeopleSoft system, and I just want to show you a couple of the use cases we have implemented, for example, around MFA. So, I mean, there are multiple ways you can attack things like MFA. You can attack it at the front door, you can attack it at field level, both, or any combination thereof. So what we've done on this system is we've got a use case that assumes that I'm a privileged user, the PS user, and I'm trying to get in to do my administrative work. Whether I'm inside the outside or outside the network, doesn't matter, although I could put controls in place that segregate the MFA from one versus the other. So if I try to sign in here as my administrator, we currently have this system set up with Duo, which is a multi-factor authentication provider. So what I'm going to do right now, and I apologize, you can't see my phone, but I have an app running on my phone, and I'm going to have the Duo send me a push. Now we'll open this up. Now I'm going to approve the request. And now I have access at my administrator level to the PeopleSoft system. So that's an example of, for example, of blocking at the front door, the application front door that allows you to control initial access for say high privileged users or users that are coming in from unknown locations. You just have a lot of flexibility on what you can do there. Now I want to log out as this user. I want to log in as a self-service user. I'm logging in as Vicky Zen. She's just coming in to check maybe her bank account records or things like that. So I'm not getting, I don't have a multi-factor authentication challenge for a self-service user. But now as Vicky Zen, I'm coming in. I want to check my direct deposit information. Now you'll see that here at a field level, we have masked the bank account number, because chances are if I'm checking on my direct deposit information, I may be wanting to change some percentages of where my check's going to, for example, one account versus another. But chances are I don't need to see or change my account number. So by default, that information is being blocked at a field level. Now, if I do want to get access to it, I'm again going back to that multi-factor authentication challenge, which puts that additional layer of security in place to validate my my identity. So if Vicky Zen's credentials for some reason got compromised, we're blocking out sensitive data so that even if somebody was able to get into PeopleSoft, they wouldn't necessarily be able to see sensitive data. So I approved that request coming into my phone, and you see I have access to the account number. But again, field level multi-factor authentication. And a key point of this as well is each of these activities is being logged. So I'm going to show you kind of some dashboards around GDPR, but everything you're seeing I'm doing within PeopleSoft is being logged. So there's a log that shows I JD Bell or Vicky Zen clicked on an MFA challenge to get access to sensitive data. So it just gives you that visibility into the system. So let's sign out as Vicky. Let's go in as a manager. This is a management level login, and what I want to show you here is another form of masking that we do. So if I want to take a look at modify a person, so I'm a manager with a department, I want to look at one of my users or one of my employees. Personal information. And I would go to modify a person. Now I'm just going to do a search for a user here. And you'll see it brought up the user record. So this is potentially one of my employees. However, you'll see down here, if you look at the bottom, the social security number, the national ID is masked. Because chances are I, as their employer or their manager, don't necessarily need to see their social security number. So by default, it's going to be masked, but it's a different sort of mask, because you'll see this mask is actually a hyperlink. So if for some reason I do need access to that social security number, I can click the hyperlink, and now I have access to that data. But the key is there that activity was logged, that I, JD Bell, as a manager, came in, looked at this record, and proactively clicked on a link to get access to sensitive data. So it gives you that additional layer of visibility, again, into activities that maybe that your users are doing. So maybe I shouldn't have access. Maybe this would trigger an alert, for example, because I shouldn't be clicking on social security numbers. You have all kinds of flexibility on how to handle the behavior, but this is kind of handling it from up front from a masking perspective. You could also implement static masking where I just can't get to it, period. So you have complete flexibility there. Now, we talked about data leakage and stuff and data getting outside the organization. What we've done here is we've got sensitive information in this, essentially this search query right here. So what happens, we've implemented a use case where if I try to download this information to Excel, we've put in a rule that says download to Excel is not allowed for sensitive data. Excuse me. So that's kind of preventing that data loss that we were talking about earlier, where data is being via query manager, via search, is trying to be extracted out. So let's go back to so now I'm an employer and I'm going into job. I want to look at some compensation information, for example, or I'm just going into job info. I'm looking for current job for a particular user. So I'm going into current job. I'm going to do a search for a user again. I'll just use the same user, but it'll work for any user. Now I'm going to go over to the compensation tab. This is one of those, like I was talking about, the breaches where people were extracting compensation information and sharing that information. What we've implemented in this use case, if I go to compensation, you'll see that the compensation rates have been redacted essentially. Sensitive data is removed both here and at the in the search window as well. So this is a good way to control, for example, your lower environments when moving production data for testing purposes or development purposes. It's really easy to set up a rule, for example, that based on the environment, the application security firewall knows that this is a development environment. It's going to automatically redact or mask sensitive information. So you get a lot of flexibility in doing that as well. So what I want to show now is you've seen a lot of the activities, and again, this information is logged as well. You've seen a lot of activities. You've seen how we're able to block, mask at a field level, a component level, a page level. There's just multiple ways to attack it based on any use case you have. But what I want to pull up right now, I was talking earlier about our logging and so on. So every activity you saw was being logged, all the clicks and everything else. So I want to show you what our analytics platform looks like. Again, we built this into a turnkey Splunk solution, and we've implemented a baseline set of dashboards. If I can get it to respond. And you'll see there are a number of dashboards here that we've implemented. Everything from performance insights, I'll show you, to GDPR. So if we look at the GDPR private information views, you see we're using live data to generate these dashboards of who's looked at what information. So for example, this count by user ID. So this is telling me that PS and PS1, the users, this is telling you the counts of how many pieces of sensitive information they looked at. And where that's being generated from is every time I did a click to view to look at, to either expose a social security number, it shows up here as an action I took to view sensitive information. So if I look at what PS1's been doing, you can get the details of every user that PS1 has looked at. So here's, for example, the IP address where where PS1 was coming from for this particular event, the user ID again of who's initiating the action. Here's the search, what employee were they looking at? And here's the rule within the rule set that was fired to support this. And you'll see this is called National ID Partial. That's where the click to view of that social security number came into play. And then you can get a lot of details in here as well. Our logging is very customizable. We support a lot of tokens that are outside the normal PeopleSoft type of logging. So you have a lot of flexibility in how these dashboards can be created. And again, these dashboards could be replicated in any SIM. We support, typical syslog log formats and so on. So this will tell me the top 10 IPs that are accessing sensitive information. And again, you get that level of detail where they were coming from and everything else. We've even set up some geolocation of national ID views coming. So, I mean, obviously, if I'm looking at this and I see some inquiries coming in from, overseas and stuff like that, some suspicious countries, that's probably something I'm going to want to look into. And again, here's the detail of the most recent views of sensitive data. We also, our dashboards, we structure our dashboards to do something else interesting in PeopleSoft by providing some performance insights. What we're doing here is utilizing our logging mechanisms to do things like, determining average page load time, breakdown by PPI level, breakdown by device type of where users are coming in from, average page load time by application. I mean, if somebody's calling me and saying, hey, HCM's running slow, can you take a look at it? I can come in here and get a feel for what pages are really slowing down the system and kind of respond to the inquiries accordingly. Top 10 slowing down pages in seconds and so on. Average page load time by location. And again, those are all generated by the logs we create. And one of the last things I want to show you is I'll show you those kind of where those logs live. The logs actually live in the web server. And let me get to it. And you have complete flexibility on the log you set up. So you'll see when I get this pulled up, you'll see we have logs for failed logins to detect brute force attacks, successful logins, where are they coming from, and so on. I'm going to go to the system console. And this is the management for the system console for the ASP platform. And this is the web server we're currently running. So I'm going to look at that, and I'm going to view log files. And you'll see here we have a ton of different logs that we've implemented on this system. Again, everything from national ID views to the GDPR. There are multiple logs, for example, that support that GDPR dashboard I showed you a moment ago. You've got total flexibility here. You can produce them in any kind of format, CSV, typical syslog. We also support, the Splunk name value pairs format as well. So at the end of the day, the Appsian Application Security Platform provides a robust, solution for getting granular level access from a visibility standpoint as well as a control standpoint into PeopleSoft. We'd love to talk to you more about it. Set up custom demos. You could look at or just shoot us an email at info@appsian.com, and we'd love to follow up with you. So Scott, I know you're still on the line. Do we have any questions?
Yes, and I would like to remind everybody that on the right side of the control panel, if you do have any questions, you can go ahead and type those in. I'm seeing a couple of people asking about a recording going out. We will certainly be sending that out via email probably tomorrow. One question I am seeing here is in regards to implementation and what exactly is involved with getting the application security platform implemented.
Sure. So I was amazed when I came on board with Appsian to just how easy this thing is to put in place. Again, it lives at the web server level. Essentially, the way implementation's done, I would say it's more dependent on a customer's testing cycles, change control processes. The actual implementation, we set up a go-to meeting with your team, and over about a 2-hour period, we get the initial install done. You guys are running hands on keyboard, we're guiding and recording the session just so you have it for future reference. Then there's an additional session that may last anywhere from an hour to 2 hours for configuration. We deploy with a set of best practice rules for the platform, and a lot of companies are fine with just that rule set and operate with that rule set for years. But if they're kind of unique use cases and stuff, we help walk you through that, configuring the rules accordingly. Typically, again, we see customers get this thing up and running within 30 to 45 days, but I've also seen it get up and running and into production in as little as a couple of days, again, based on accelerated testing cycles and so on. And again, it is a plugin. It's a simple plugin at the web server level, and a PeopleSoft project that installs the config pages and other things as well.
Very good. And just because it looks like we're about out of time, I think that's really all we have. So JD, if you have any parting thoughts, I think we are good to sign off.
Okay, great. And guys, again, thanks for the attendance. Info@appsian.com, and we will get back to you as quickly as possible. Look forward to following up with you. Thank you, everyone.